ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bambang Harymurti. I'm very honored here because Herr Hendrik Loneke has asked me to moderate this very important to me and timely discussion about the perspective, local perspective of our own post-colonial history. I myself, being advocate for freedom of expression, would sometimes call the fact that we have a country called Indonesia is actually another name of Pax Nederlandica. Because without being colonialized by the Dutch, we would not be one country, but probably quite a few sultanate and kingdom and many Brunei, maybe something like that. But history has stated that because we were colonized by the Netherlands for quite a long time, they also we all become one nation, supposed to be modern nation with all its goodness and badness. And I'm going to introduce to our speaker today. We are very honored to have Professor Chua Beng from Singapore. Actually, if you don't know how good this person is, you should buy a book called Liberalism Discovered, Communitarianism and State Capitalism in Singapore. This is last year, I think 2017, and you will understand why it is an honor for us to have Professor Chua Beng to give his presentation today. And you can read about his bio in this book anyway. But then we are also very fortunate that we have Farid, which is the Director General of Culture, but has always been. It's actually very interesting. Maybe he's one of the first non-government pegawai negeri who became dirjen. That's something new. And maybe that is mean there are some hope for all of you also. But it shows that he must be really good that he can read all of his civil servant to become a dirjen and his field. And we are also having Pak Andi Achdian. Of course, if he speaks in University Indonesia, we don't have to doubt anything. Otherwise, we will be all yellow jacket will come to us and protect us. So Pak Achdian is a lecturer at Sociology department. But I will introduce the other later on. But now I would like to have the honor to call Professor Chua Beng to present the presentation because after this he has to catch a flight to Singapore. Give a round of applause for that.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me see how do I start. What I want to talk about actually is not the post-colonial discourse, but the absence of post-colonial discourse in Southeast Asia. And the reason why this was the noticeable difference is quite interesting because my starting point is the reading of a very small book by Robert Young called An Introduction to Post-Colonialism. Or a short history of it's actually called a short history of post-colonialism. And what really surprised me was in reading through the book that there was almost no mention at all of Southeast Asia in the history of post-colonialism, according to Robert Young. And this was, of course, fairly puzzling because Southeast Asia is probably one of the most colonized space in the 19th century up to the span of Second World War. The only country in Southeast Asia that could claim not to have been colonized was Thailand, but Thailand had undoubtedly suffered seriously semi-colonial status. under both the French and the British, and had in fact ceded a lot of extraterritorial privileges to the colonial, to French and British colonial power. So, and in this little book, Vietnam had come out for about 2 or 3 sentences. And here, this is a country that faced the most protracted colonial struggle that went on in a very, very costly manner until arguably middle 1970s. Because after defeating the French, it was engaged in a very long and violent war with the Americans, which the Vietnamese called the American War, and the Americans, of course, called it the Vietnam War. Now, one could, of course, attribute the absence of Southeast Asia in the book to the ignorance of Robert Young himself. But this would be actually too simplistic, because an introductory text on any topic is usually a reflection and summary of the field of research. And but furthermore, when one look at the writings in English, and I must emphasize that I'm talking about the writing in English and not in any other languages, that the post-colonial literature in English, if you look at the library of post-colonial literature in English, you will see that Southeast Asia is indeed absent in the academic discourse called post-colonial studies. So I'm using the term post-colonial studies, using the term discourse in a much more seriously technical Foucauldian sense, and not just as a sort of public discussion, but actually as a systematic epistemological frame for producing new knowledge. So what is interesting is that how do we explain this absence? How do we explain the absence of post-colonial writing in Southeast Asia in English? So in order to when you try to explain an absence, it's very different from trying to explain a phenomenon that's taken place, because the way I would choose to think about absence is to look at other situations where there is a presence, and then ask the question of what are the elements that creates the presence, and why are those elements absent in where it is absent. So this kind of way of questioning, if you come from being very Singaporean, being always asked, why is there no corruption in Singapore? And you really cannot answer is because Lee Kuan Yew was moralist, because he wasn't really. So you have to kind of figure out other strategies of trying to explain why there isn't corruption in Singapore. So you look at the rest of the region and then see what elements that produce corruption were absent in Singapore. And that's why they're absent. So in that sense, I want to ask, to raise the question of absence, one needs to look at its presence elsewhere. So, for those of you who are familiar with the writings on post-colonialism, you would have noticed that in the English library, the last part of the post-colonial corpus is actually dominated by studies in South Asia, largely, particularly Indian scholars, and to a lesser extent in the book itself, writings from North Africa, including some of the French colonies. Now the question is, what are the socio-political conditions that can account for the intellectual preoccupation with the post-colonial conditions in South Asia, right? And here I'm going to step on the toe of Divya because I'm going to make very generalized statement. It's an observation of the Indian intellectual condition from the outside. So please don't take offense if it's disagreeable. So I'm a little bit more familiar with the South Asian material, having worked with several scholars, and so I'm going to use that
as the kind of to answer the question of the presence. What strikes me about Indian scholars is a very deep concern about history. So my own sense have always been, including my recent visit to New Delhi at a conference last December, is that the Indian scholars can be said to be burdened by history. I mean, they carry history very heavily. And, you know, I suppose this is likely a consequence of the unbroken Indian civilization of several millennia, and the substance of which is increasingly contested along religious and caste lines and regional differences. So against this very long and deep history, the 1 century of British colonial, of the British Raj, of the colonial period may be considered actually a very short but highly significant disruption that brought the modern unified Indian federal states into existence. So the impacts of this disruption, including the destruction of the indigenous economy, the pacification and annexation of princedoms, which forms the territorial basis of the new Indian state, and the central federal government after independence, and the subsequent very violent partition that divides Pakistan and India. All this remains embedded in unresolved issues in contemporary India and other parts of South Asia. So in a certain sense, the current rise of the BJP is very much rhetorically grounded in the supposed recovery of the Hindu nation that existed before colonization. So, and secondly, politically, post-independent India seems to be quite comfortable with, if not proud of, its development into a stable democratic state with a mix of a mix of economic socialism, Indian style, and a relatively liberal democratic polity, particularly in its constitution. So this is perhaps, you know, this is why India is constantly, proudly says it's the world's largest democracy. The liberal constitution and the continuous parliamentary dominance of the Indian Congress Party, until fairly recently displaced by the BJP, had in fact glossed over fairly deep divisions of religion and castes and its attendant social and political economic inequalities. But these divisions remains percolating under the surface, waiting for opportunity or excuses to express themselves openly. And the division has been politically exploited by the BJP in its ascendancy and displacement of the Indian Congress with its Hindu nationalism, and increasingly Islamic phobia. So meanwhile, so those are the kind of, you know, political historical questions. The third possible factor is that its extensive state economic sector, which is burdened by heavy bureaucracy and endemic corruption at all levels, actually stood in the way of rapid post-independent rapid economic development. To the extent that economic underdevelopment and the endemic politics of caste and religions have their roots in colonial political economy, the colonial history continues to be a point of reference and a resource for post-colonial discourse. So the development of underdevelopment, as you know, this phrase that comes from Andre Gunterfang, talking about Latin America, the development of underdevelopment being a phenomenon which actually feeds into post-colonial discourse itself. And as recently as last June, when I was in Calcutta, Padajadaji actually gave a public lecture in Calcutta on the white podium of the most impressive edifice of the colonial era, the Victoria Memorial Hall, which was, given that it was Padajadaji giving a public talk that was packed with local intellectual community in spite of the 45 degrees temperature. I almost fainted in the middle of the crowd. And Padajadaji's title, and this is reflection of the, you know, the sort of importance of post-colonial discourse in in India today, still continues to be. Paracharji's lecture was, is Calcutta still a colonial city? And his answer was, yes, it is, because the elite class of the city remains colonized in their mentality, and that their intellectual reference points remains largely in England, in the British universities. So, of course, given Chatterjee, this was the fact that he claims that it remains a colonial city was, of course, a lament, as the desire was, of course, that the colonial remnant should have been gone a long time ago. So this is kind of question of asking in a different context, has the West influence on Asia? Is the West influence on Asia still relevant? And the answer should have been, if it isn't, it should have been a long time ago. So the same kind of sentiment. So judging by my readings of the comparative regional social sciences, and perhaps because I'm blindsided by the fact that I'm a Singaporean, I would argue that the absence of post-colonial discourse in Southeast Asia is in part the absence of the conditions that are present in South Asia, particularly in the case of India. Although empirically the post-independence experience of Southeast Asian countries should be considered, we should have considered separately, one case by case, but I would argue that it's demonstrable that there are some commonalities throughout the region, which I will try to explain. The interesting thing is that in spite of the histories, we have the same kind of religious history, right? Because we have the history of Buddhist, Hindu kingdoms and empires across the entire region, the monuments of which remain standing as relics in places like Angkor Wat, Borobudur, Bagan in Myanmar, and Ayutthaya in Thailand. But contemporary Southeast Asian scholars seem to wear the regional history very lightly, with the exception possible of historians. The suppression and erasure of the deep-seated civilizational past by European colonization seem to be of little interest today to Southeast Asian scholars. Colonial history has been largely confined to professional historians, and the social sciences' interest in history is largely focused on post-Second World War, including the decolonization process, and particularly post-independence economic and social development. This may be partly because, in contrast to the relatively stable post-independent Indian state, in Southeast Asia, after political independence, almost all the Southeast Asian states were immediately pushed into the front line of the Cold War, which in the case of Asia was a very hot war, starting with the Korean War, followed by the Vietnam War. Regardless of whether the countries have emerged out of protracted or violent decolonization struggles against the colonial regime, as in the case of Indonesia and Vietnam, or were decolonized peacefully, as in the case of Malaya, Philippines. Philippines is a bit ambiguous, but Singapore definitely. The new states were embroiled in protracted insurgency or civil wars instigated by the two contesting ideologies and their respective sponsoring states. The longest war, of course, was the one in Vietnam. And as a consequence, all the new states in Southeast Asia struggled to stabilize themselves. And in almost all instances, stability came in different guises of an authoritarian state, which systematically suppressed through legal and illegal means, including mass murder in some cases, the very organic political left, which would have been critical participants in the decolonization process. With the decimation of the intellectual left, the nation's capacity to critically reflect on its colonial past was very severely disrupted. And in their place, the technocrats had been elevated to run the new state, right? By the mid-1970s, all Southeast Asian states had already achieved varying degrees of stability under authoritarian regimes, which are either socialist or non-socialist. In the non-socialist states, ostensibly popularly elected political leaders, who actually in reality were often lacking in legitimacy for a multitude of economic and political corrupt practices, often had to depend on the military to stay in power. While the military strongman would, on the other hand, would wait in the wings to dispose of the elected regimes at the slightest excuse, including the apparently indecision of the ruling government because of prolonged debates that are the practice of democratic states. So by the mid-1970s, almost every country in Southeast Asia is an authoritarian state, whether elected or otherwise. Right? But at the same time, the political betrayal of the promise of democracy was actually put on the back burner as the relatively stable authoritarian states start to launch into industrial economic development in order to ground their own legitimacy through development. And in this process, they adopt the developmental state model of East Asian economies, such as Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the ethnically Chinese dominant Singapore, seeking to achieve political legitimacy in spite of the corruption, in spite of the political repression, through economic development and the improvement of material life of citizens. I mean, Indonesians will be very familiar with this process because the Suharto era essentially developed the developmental state to continue his own legitimacy. Right. The only country in Southeast Asia that failed to do that in that particular period would have been Philippines because of Marcos. So this generalized trajectory of Southeast Asian nations so once the Southeast Asian state adopt the developmental state strategy of economic development, and emerging out of years of instability and political instability and material deprivation, the economic development strategies effectively sucks up all the energies of the population and bringing along many academics and intellectuals into the nation-building projects. So these development efforts dovetail nicely with the globalization of capitalism through the new international division of labor in a period where industries facing high cost of production in their home countries were looking for platforms of low wages to produce low-end consumer goods. So the rapid development of Southeast Asian countries, first Singapore, followed Singapore, Malaysia, and then subsequently Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand, effectively got very quickly integrated into global capitalism. And the developmental states are compelled to keep their focus on the future rather than on the past. So the past effectively largely forgotten. And for the developmental states, the emergency reference points are at once global and market-driven, and in this case, possibly inter-Asia models, inter-Asia references, rather than metropolitan Europe, which is why we don't think about the colonial past very often in the last 30 years, since about middle 70s. So this generalized trajectory of Southeast Asian nations, in this general trajectory, I've been fairly negligent of several important elements of phenomena that could have been evoked to construct a post-colonial discourse in Southeast Asia. Firstly, it neglects the historical significant individuals who stood against and reflected on the colonial conditions and sacrificed themselves for national independence. The classic case in this case will be Jose Rizal of the Philippines. Secondly, I've neglected also specific historical instances in which the idea and substance of the post-colonial featured very importantly, The singularly most important moment was, of course, the 1955 Bandung Conference. The gathering of Asian and African post-colonial nations motivated by a desire to strike an independent path between the two co-op ideologies and alliances, in spite of the fact of the presence, very, very obvious presence of Communist China. But now looking back, the Bandung Conference have effectively transformed into what we now call the Bandung spirit. And the Bandung spirit is I would say that it is actually continues to be a political myth that keeps getting evoked rather than evolve into actually a global political movement. We now talk longingly, nostalgically about Bandung rather than Bandung as the driving force for political change. And then finally, I would have, what I have actually said about the absence of Southeast Asia in post-colonial discourse, as I said, I had to emphasize the absence is in English. And in that sense, I have neglected important narratives in local languages. And here, Hilmar and I edited a particular issue of post-colonial studies in which Hilmar has an article in it. And I want to here recall Hilmar's contribution to that particular issue of post-colonial studies on Southeast Asia. His essay actually examines the non-elite popular narratives in Low Malay, which are critical of and reflective of colonial conditions. Indeed, the Malay language has facilitated the development of a very identifiable regional critical intellectual community during the late colonialism period, before the region becomes divided by new national boundaries of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And also, in other instances, it is widely acknowledged that the most anti-colonial elements in pre-independent Singapore were the Chinese educated. And they were also the most engaged in critical cultural production in various aesthetic medium, from novels to photography to woodcut prints that actually reflected the colonial conditions. So the radical individuals, the historical events, and the cultural productions and practices in local vernacular are actually rich resources for the constitution of post-colonial discourse in Southeast Asia, both within a particular nation and regionally. But yet, I still wonder if there were any serious motivations among contemporary academics in Southeast Asia to undertake such a project. So finally, let me disclose some of my prejudices. I want to close with a statement of Singapore as a kind of strange post-colonial society, and a fairly exceptional kind of post-colonial society. Singapore is actually very atypical post-colonial or colonized territory, because its colonization did not involve the usual process of the suppression of the colonized and of their culture and institutions. It also did not involve the decimation of the indigenous population. Singapore is in effect a settler nation where the ancestor of the current citizens came as immigrants to the island after the British East India Company set up a trading post. Even arguably, the present Malay population in Singapore are descendants of migrants from the region rather than local on the island itself. However, unlike other settler nations such as Canada, Australia, and the United States, the majority of the citizens are not descendants of the colonizing white race from the metropolitan centers. At the point of our political independence, the majority Chinese population recognized that as immigrant stock, they had no legitimate proprietary claim to the nation territorially. So the political leaders were compelled to recognize the minority Malays as the indigenous people and assign some special status constitutionally. It had also It had also no indigenous political structure that could be dusted off and reinstalled as the governing structure of the new state. Consequently, Singapore was constituted as in the image of a modern Westphalia state with the British parliamentary system and all the inherited instruments of an institution of governance, which the long-ruling PAP government constantly modified to its own political advantage, all within due parliamentary process in which it has absolute control. Consequently, the colonial past in Singapore is more embraced than criticized, especially by the English university-educated elite that has come to dominate politics and parliament since 1950s. Ironically, however, it is in the bicentennial anniversary of the arrival of Raffles, who set up the trading post on behalf of the East India Company, and subsequent officers with cunning that slowly usurped the entire island from the Johor Real Empire until it was transferred to the colonial office in 1876. So in this bicentennial anniversary, as a reflection, partly I think because we have become a much more confident nation, the Singaporean, particularly as an economically successful nation, what was previously taken for granted as benign colonialism and beneficial presence of the British is now being questioned against and beginning to raise the question of how colonialism has exploited the Asian population. The place of Raffles, which has been until now unquestionably valorized as the founder of the island, symbolically cast on a pedestal upon which he stands as a statue, his position is now beginning to be questioned and somewhat displaced. His duplicity, cunning, and self-serving ambition is being raised finally anew. And yet, I do not think that this will engender post-colonial studies in Singapore, because I believe by the time our bicentennial celebration is over, we would nicely put Raffles away again and not think about him anymore. Because Britain has not been a reference point for Singapore for a long time now. Especially with a per capita income that now exceeds that of Britain, things British have ceased to be reference points for Singaporean people and government, except in the case of tertiary education. Here, the premier universities such as Cambridge and Oxford, and the lesser ones such as the LSE and University College London still holds as desired education destinations. But they have been slowly but surely displaced by the premier universities of the United States. And more recently, most government scholarship holders have opted to go to universities, not only in the US, but some have opted to go to China. So, and the model for the National University of Singapore is not Cambridge or Oxford, but Harvard of the East. So from a Singaporean perspective, post-colonial studies had no past and is unlikely to have any future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chua Beng Huat. You know, when I heard the last part of your speech, remind me quickly to the first scene of the movie Crazy Rich Asian, where Singaporean elite came to a British hotel, was sort of being snubbed, and turned out that she made a phone call, and turned out the hotel has changed ownership to the husband of the Crazy Rich Asians. So, but that is, of course, the lightweight, answer to your very good presentation, because we have a real pro to give you a comment on this, and I would like to call Professor Andi Achdian He's from lecturer from National University, which is the oldest private university in Indonesia. Right? Yes, and the one who also fight against the colonialism at that time. So without much ado, let's have him on the board and make us proud to be Indonesia. Right?
Thank you, Moderator. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation to Goethe-Institut that make this forum happen. And I'm also honored for the opportunity to make comments to Professor Chua Beng Huat, a leading figure in the field of cultural studies in Southeast Asia. Let me read my comment. Post-colonial theory, as you might know, has many phases, questions, and pose many problems related to the contemporary condition of what happened in Global South. It has also an intellectual drive that questioning the unequal relation between the West, the East, center and periphery, domination and subordination. And Professor Chua Beng Huat's discussion regarding the absence of post-colonial studies in Southeast Asia is interesting for me. To give a flesh and blood in my comments to Beng Huat's presentation, I would like to add some aspect from Indonesian history, the field that I'm much more confident. Professor Beng Huat's presentation inspired me to think again about the historical production in Indonesia. I want to discuss here the conservative ideology that helped to contribute to the lack of critical engagement of scholars in Indonesia to reflect critically of their past, especially the colonial past. By so doing, I will focus my account to the works of one important Indonesian historian, Ong Kokam, in his book Runtuhnya Hindia Belanda, or The Demise of Dutch Netherlands in this State, that I found relevant to our discussion. His work is a typical Dutch voice than Indonesian voice that the reader will find to his discussion about Indonesian nationalist movement until the demise of Dutch in the state following the Japanese occupation. His book is a good illustration about how historian who moved against the grain to the general rule of historical inquiry of his time, the Indonesian centrist approach. Indonesian centrist approach is an approach that turned the historical table where Indonesians became the main actor of historical drama, displacing the Nederlandocentrists, which put the Dutch at the center of historical event. This approach is problematic to a certain extent in his view, Ong Kokam's view, a one-sided of history that deliberately dilute the past, especially the colonial past. In the introduction section in his book, he boldly said why he deliberately chose to write in Nederlandocentrist approach as to show to his audience that at least the Dutch ever exist in Indonesian history, and their presence undeniably shaped the development of modern Indonesian nation. What is relevant to Ong Kokam's historical method is the awareness that the missing aspect of colonial history in Indonesia is not a matter of individual predilection, but ideological. The state-driven historical production in which history became the working ideology of the state. This state-driven historical production, unfortunately, has also found a strong foothold in the academic and later constitute as mainstream in Indonesian historiography. We will find it most expression under New Order regime, imbued with technocratic and pragmatic vision to modernize the country. We found that kind of historical writing that was and is ideologically motivated to serve the regime. History is again a working ideology of the regime. Under this condition, the Indonesian centrist has become a new moral that steadily diluted other beyond native Indonesian, the Dutch, the Indo-Europe, the Chinese, and etc., in the making of Indonesia as a new nation. The role of the Dutch in shaping their colony gone, and even to some extent erased from the narrative. Colonialism is simply seen as the relation between hero and villain. This approach to some extent has also accepted a greater influence in public policy today. Take for example the Indonesian Heritage Law, Undang-Undang Nomor 11 2010 tentang cagar budaya. This is the thing that I personally experienced as part of Jakarta's heritage team. This decree stipulated a category that selects certain historical building or structure as heritage if it represents Indonesian value, personality, and culture. Well, this is of course an awkward position. How could we say one or particular colonial building with a fine architectural achievement could symbolize the Indonesian value, culture, or personality? That's the question. As historian, Ongko Kam was an interesting figure. He has an obsession about Java and the Javanese culture, its tradition and folk culture, which often became an important part in his analysis about modern Indonesian society, especially under the New Order regime. But there are certain conditions from his personal background that might influence his talk that critically saw the danger inside the Indonesian centrist approach. Ongko Kam was a Peranakan Chinese with strong Dutch education during his upbringing. Dutch is the first language that was spoken in the family, and Bahasa Indonesia came later at his teen age. I wonder, had he exposed to the post-colonial studies theory, we might expect a champion for post-colonial studies in Indonesia, maybe. But what is more important in his approach to history is, beyond the need to celebrate and help to define the course for a new nation, history is also a critical enterprise, which is not only a matter of academic hustle-bustle, but an enterprise to empower the people. So this is an important point of our dealing with history, including the colonial history. Regardless the problems of the absence of historical reflection in Southeast Asian countries, and Indonesia in particular, I would like to reiterate here some problems related to the framework of post-colonial theory development in Indonesia. Over the past 2 decades, post-colonial studies have acquired considerably visibility in academic circles, especially in literary and cultural studies. There are 2 trends under this development. The first, at the first glance, might represent a kind of familiarity among academics in Indonesia with the very latest conceptual advance. Its conceptual repertoire can be found in works of many kinds. But we will find here that this is the development of the field style only, a conceptual inflation, but not its substance. On the other side, there is also interesting development where scholars raise some critical assessment to this field. Melanie Budianta has rightly emphasized the need to reorienting the studies by criticizing the rigid dichotomies in its binary opposition between core periphery, the West and the East, majority minorities, which is problematic according to Budianta. Hilmar Farid also, in another direction, has also presented the need to contextualize and historicize it, especially in terms of its treatment to the nationalist ideology, which according to him has many nuances than the existing framework can offer. I also welcome this position by adding that modernity is not always negative and to some extent has played a major role in the progress of anti-colonial politics in Indonesian history. As concluding remark, I would like to note here the success of Azari Ayub, a young writer from Aceh who has just won the Khatulistiwa Award, a prestigious award for literature in Indonesia. His works, titled Kura-Kura Berjanggut or Bear the Turtle, has successfully integrated various problems related to the peculiar condition where the people in Aceh, the most western province in Indonesia, express uneasy relation to the established concept of nation, religion, power relation, domination and subordination in their long historical struggle against the Dutch colonial as well as the government that they helped to create. The novel itself is a good reminder that Acehnese has only left the brutal experience of war and grave human rights violation only just a decade ago. Ayub's works warrant an intention that a critical approach to understand literature, history, and culture under the so-called post-colonial study maybe has its own merit in Indonesia today. There's a promise about post-colonial study anyway, as it initially claimed. It is not just a study about colonial history, but also to enable political practice, a form of practice or even of movement relevant to anyone who has common political and ethical commitment, challenging and questioning the practice and consequence of domination and subordination, as Azari does through his work. This is the value of our discussion today, and Professor Beng's presentation is therefore an important reminder of this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. When you gave these arguments, it remind me of maybe Professor Chua also knows. In the 50s, we have quite famous what we call polemic kebudayaan, cultural polemic between those who feel that, you know, since we are independent from the West colonialized, so we should have our own culture as alternative to the West culture. But the other side say, no, actually, you know, the West can conquer us because they have a better technology, better everything, so we should change our cultures into these things, yeah, and beat them in their own culture. But now we have an expert on intercultural things, actually, which is Dr. Hilmar Farid will maybe give that view, because to me, it seems that in Singapore, as a settler nation, you prefer to move on, forget the past, move on to the future, while your colleague from India seem to have this culture of, because they have such a great history, it's become a burden for them. It's very difficult to move on, maybe. I don't know. Indonesians usually like the balance. Let's hear what Dr. Hilmar Farid says. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So to start with, I fully agree with the closing sentence of Beng Huat's presentation, that post-colonial theory or post-colonial studies had no history in Singapore and more, or most likely, no future. And the same can be said actually about Indonesia. You know? And I think Andi's comment to Beng Huat's presentation also shared a similar view about that. And this is the first session, right, of the whole conference. It's a dark start, no? Where we all agree that, well, there might be some use of post-colonial theory and so on. So I just want to balance this, the comments from Beng Huat, the presentation from Beng Huat and Andi's comments on that, with some questions. How can issues that were addressed in post-colonial studies be relevant for us today here in Indonesia? No? So, but before we can do that, of course, we need to not clearly define in terms of limiting post-colonial studies, but understand what it is really. No? So, regardless of the theoretical background, political impetus, and everything, I think still post-colonial studies, post-colonial criticism is a way to look for alternatives to mainstream development. I mean, that's, in my understanding, that's what it was. No? And of course, it's informed by different scientific disciplines, literary histories there, development studies. Some would go to feminism, race studies, and so on. So it has a very rich theoretical, intellectual background. And it really attempted to formulate alternatives to mainstream development and address very important issues as well. No? For example, if you look at Indonesian historiography, you can hardly find women, children, the underprivileged, people without history, and all these, not to mention geographical isolated areas. No mention about that in mainstream historical writings. No? So post-colonial brought this up. How can we understand our condition, our society, in a much more comprehensive way? And I think in that sense, post-colonial studies is a critique of the capitalist society in the non-Western world. No? But it was also in search of alternatives from the major force that challenged mainstream capitalist development. In the context of India, this was the organized left. Yeah? So it was in constant conversation with that. The organized left, of course, had their formulas that you need to build class power, to abolish state power, and so on. I mean, that's what the organized left intended to do, and all the theoretical formulations that come up in that struggle was informed by that, these problems. No? So if you look then into post-colonial studies or their siblings like subaltern studies and all that, it's always in response to that, yeah? That the organized left failed to understand society, and that's why they also failed to bring about change. And that later on turned into very established political machineries that are actually part of that dominant system that they are supposed to abolish. No? And that's how I think many issues in post-colonial studies are derived from. Yeah? In Indonesia, and that's exactly the problem, the absence of the organized left. I mean, you don't have that conversation with the organized left. So, for example, if we bring up, say, subaltern here might be what? A radical Wong Cilik, something like that, no? And there's no conversation with, say, the people who would propagate like a labor perspective on issues. No, you don't have that. No? So back in the 1970s, major or the dominant discourse in social sciences was development, pembangunan. Yeah, it has no class. Even class was forbidden at the time to be mentioned. If you wrote an article in those days, use class, you will not be published in Compass. Yeah, for sure. Tempo, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, you have a different set of problems that we confronted that. Authoritarianism was much more the discourse of the day among people who were critical of the government, no? And I think here we have more direct connections on an intellectual level with our friends in Latin America, yeah? Living under military dictatorships, authoritarian societies, and so on. So I think this explains why back in the 80s and the 90s, when post-colonial studies was on the rise, there was little interaction with intellectuals here in Indonesia. But this doesn't mean that we never thought about these issues ourselves. If you look into our history, Indonesian intellectual history is actually rich of all these questions. Back in the 50s and 60s, we anticipated things that are later discussed in post-colonial studies, right? Of course, the most prominent person in that in this context for me would be Pramudia Anantatur. I mean, if you look in at his studies from the 1960s, early 1960s about Indonesian literary history, the history of Indonesian language, and political history as well, I mean, you really can find or see how he devoted his intellectual energy to debunk the dominant view or perspective in Indonesian history, which at that time was very much influenced by the Dutch. And there have been many interesting initiatives. For example, like stenography. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore now, but at that time, the idea was that the dominant stenography at the time was derived or was designed based on the phonetics of European languages. So we needed ones of our own. So all these like initiatives, interesting things that happened at that time are, I think, still poorly studied by us. I'm now, there are two things that I'm more interested in now. One are these classical thinkers, no? And going back to people like Ki Ageng Suryo Mentaram, etc. Not because of the mysticism and everything, but these were attempts to rethink epistemology, yeah, at a very serious level, actually. I mean, you have that not only in Java, but Sumatra and in different parts of my job now. allows me to travel a lot and to meet up with scholars from different parts of the country, really to absorb this intellectual energy, you know? So that's one thing. And the other is not intercultural history, but interspecies interaction, no? that we need to understand much better now if you want to talk about the environment, the survival of the planet, and so on. No? So my as a conclusion or as a closing statement, it is to these ideas, our intellectual history back in the 1930s, 1950s, and 60s, very important in many regards. So it is to these blocks of thought that I would devote my intellectual energy before I turn my attention to somewhere else. I think that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farid. And now I think I would like to give Professor Chua to respond to all this comment from Dr. Farid and Andi.
Actually, I don't have much of a response because I don't think we disagree fundamentally with our observations about post-independent Southeast Asian nations, between particularly Indonesia and Singapore. And I think that as I said in my closing, that there were, if we were looking into vernacular practices in narrative forms and visual aesthetic forms, in the pre-independent period, they were actually rich resources for the construction of a post-colonial studies, a post-colonial discourse, as Hilmar has said, that if you look at Indonesia in the Indonesian works in the 1950s and 60s, before all this development, nation-building talk become mainstream, you will actually be able to construct. You will see that there is a resource, intellectual tradition that could have been resurrected into a post-colonial discourse. But as I said, this was largely displaced by the desire to move into economic development. And I suppose ironically, it's precisely because because the countries were successful in the economic development that the amnesia is even deeper, because we now have no time for the past. We just have, we increasingly spend our energy trying to preserve what we already have gained materially in material life, and afraid of losing that. And that's actually much more anxiety causing than actually any reflection of the past. So, and I think the idea of, Andy's idea that history is the ideology of nation is actually part of that construction. That, history is always political that way. Like the Singapore, until this bicentennial celebration, the very explicit ideological formulation of history in Singapore was to precisely begin with 1819, the arrival of Raffles. And that's a very conscious ideological decision, because to try to claim a larger history that goes back to the regional history of the region would have brought into Singapore political tensions of religion, race, and so on, and the new nation probably could not bear that weight. And so that very conscious political choice was interesting. And as I said, now that we are more confident about ourselves, we can now look back and claim a bigger place in the history of, Asia, and particularly Southeast Asia, right? Because Singaporeans have to constantly remind themselves that the world doesn't need Singapore, but Singapore needs the world. And so the bigger footprint we can claim for the long term, the better.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a very good response. Now we have 15 minutes left, and it's my duty to offer you to come. First of all, let me put my glasses on so I can see you. Okay. Yes, one, what, two, and one? Okay, please give the mic there, and then the second one here. Sini. Yeah, okay. We'll start with you, yes, please, and please identify yourself.
Do I need to stand up? Okay, maybe. My name is Karib. I'm a PhD student from Binghamton University in the United States. Well, maybe it's more like a dialogue and comment. I will try to read it. I guess the question is not whether we have a colonial past, and now we are in the period of post-colonialism. Instead, we have to acknowledge and ask, are we still in a colonial present and part of the new empire after the World War II? In the present American University, an intellectual discourse from David Harvey, from Antonio Negri, and Stoller that talk about Indonesia, we recognize the new empire since post-World War II. This reflects that Southeast Asian still living in colonial relations with the new empire master. In this context, as Southeast Asians and Indonesians particularly, we have to demystify the fact that we are not in post-colonial era. So I guess we ask a lot of questions about the past, but how about the colonial presence? So I guess that's my comment. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me introduce myself. Thank you for moderator. My name is Samudra, and I'm from Indonesian University of Education. And I will ask to the speakers in the front. This question is, when the Dutch colonies in Indonesia, many cities in Indonesia, for the city name, are to use in the Dutch language, such as Batavia now is Jakarta, or Buitenzorg is now Bogor. But after Indonesia independence, the city name was changed by Sukarno. Is too different from the British and Spanish colonialization in South Asia. The British and Spanish colonialization are still used to their language to the city name in their countries. And last question, I will ask to Mr. Chuang Beng Huat. The question is, I will ask about the Lee Kuan Yew, is founder of Singapore. But in Malaysia, why people in Malaysia is very hate to him, Lee Kuan Yew? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Diulang. The last one. Ulang lagi pertanyaannya.
Yang mana? Oh, ya. I will ask to about Lee Kuan Yew. Why people in Malaysia is very hate to Lee Kuan Yew? Hate.
Oh, okay.
Lee Kuan Yew.
Hate. Okay. Yeah. And can you give also here? Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Beng Huat, for your lecture. And if we can agree with Hilmar, Farid, that this is a dark opening, I at least might celebrate that for reasons which I will mention in my own panel, but I think Professor Beng Huat will not be there. And hence my question to you, if on your last point in your rejoinders, if you are concerned with the loss of this rich material in literature which has to do with lived traditions and with the lived past, then surely there are many kinds of studies and academic disciplines that can deal with that. But what came with post-colonialism was a theory for a specific kind of consciousness and a specific kind of history. So in that sense, if one has to rue the loss of history, then what would you say, or rather, would you be happy to admit the specifically post-colonialist form of history, which in fact also will begin from the colonial moment, and perhaps will exclude much that came before that? And even in what it deals with after the colonial moment, it will be quite selective. And you know, some of those selections we are living with in the subcontinent, as you mentioned in the beginning of your talk. So the difference between the past and history, which is a post-colonialist history. Thank you.
May you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Divya Devedi.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else before I? Okay.
Thank you. My name is Rio. I'm a student of International Relations from Universitas Ponegoro, Semarang. Mr. Hilmar Farid was mentioned about post-colonialism is about alternative ideas. Then I was talk about something about an epistemological question. In international relations, we have a discourse about non-Western IR theory. And it comes to my mind that when did Indonesia become Indonesia in its sense? When did the Southeast Asia as a region become Southeast Asia as its region? Because there was no Indonesia, there was no Southeast Asia, there was Dutch East Indies, there was French Indochina, there was even Myanmar was under the British India at that time. So we are created by the concept of a very Westphalian concept of states. Is there from any of the speakers, is there any possible ideas that we as the decolonized countries develop a sense of identity, a sense of a different concept of states that will totally decolonize us from the Western ideas? Thank you.
Thank you. All good questions. Professor Chua, you want to answer first?
Let me see. The sort of the very first question of what? Yeah. This notion that, you know, somehow this idea that the new hegemon is the United States and the writing of the US dominance as empire, it's a very different kind of formulation of colony, right? Because this is a kind of economic domination without administration costs. So in a sense, I mean, we're not really talking about the same kind of phenomena. And then that becomes also, to me, I mean, for us, increasingly difficult as now China rising. So we're not talking about a single hegemon. We're talking about another hegemon in emergence, which are actually probably much more consequential for the rest of Asia in the next in the present century. So I think that, you know, we need to make a distinction between different notions of empire and different notion of what is colonization. That's one. The question of why Malaysia hates Singapore, isn't that obvious? It is one of the most interesting irony of the 20th century that a country voluntarily gave up the most prosperous cities that it owns. It is actually, until today, for me, inconceivable. But it happened. Singapore, even in the days of underdevelopment of the region, was by the 1930s and 40s the richest city in Southeast Asia. For Malaysia to finally say, I think you should go your own way, is something that is very difficult to imagine. Okay, and I think that's why Mahathir continues to give us a lot of problems. Because it's truly difficult to imagine. Most countries cling on to his territory, tooth and nail, this is the only one instance in which the most prosperous city is let go to develop on its own. And I think the reason why that is, speculatively, the reason why that is the case is because Malaysia or the, the Malayan ruling class believe that Singapore will not succeed and will therefore come back and ask to be reintegrated. So we succeeded beyond expectations, not only of others, but of ourselves, right? So that's, but I think that's actually a very, in that sense, I think Singapore separation from Malaysia is actually quite a stunning sort of phenomena in the 20th century political history. All right. The question of, if we were to resurrect some of the materials in the past, will we still put it necessarily under post-colonial theory? That's actually an interesting question. The Singapore case is much more difficult, right? Because technically speaking, seriously, there was no, because of the fact that we are a settler nation, until we became an independent nation, most of the local populations are actually externally oriented, right? So for example, Chandra Bose started the Indian Army, Independence Army in Singapore, right? This is the other part of the non-Gandhian independence movement. And the Singapore Chinese community that was politically extremely radical actually lived off and has its reference point of post-dynastic China, right? Of the Republican Revolution, the first May 4th Cultural Revolution. So when I was a kid, all the literature I read were highly modernist, Lucian stuff. So again, it doesn't have a kind of British angle to this, right? And the Malay communities were actually very interested in the Indonesian independence movement. So we are very externally oriented. The moment that Singaporeans could invest emotionally in something called Singapore really is sort of post-1965, right? So how would we reconstruct this? Our reference points will probably be, and again, fairly Asian kind of reference point rather than the conventional British metropolitan instance. Right? But I think that is quite different from Indonesia or other places where the indigenous population were colonized, and therefore, the reference point will be of their colonization. Right? I think that's.
Any alternative idea about non-Western theory?
My position is that a lot of terms, a lot of the concepts we use has an origin in the West, but at some point that origin must be dropped. And those terms must be used as possession of the global and not constantly referred to the West, right? If you constantly refer to the West, you will permanently be captured without freedom. So I don't worry very much about the fact that Southeast Asia as a region is a construct of, it's almost a Cold War idea and all that. But I think it's more importantly to think about ASEAN as our own creation and for our own purposes. Right? Okay. So is there a Western theory of the state? Yes, there were. There were all kinds of Western. There were all kinds of Westphalian state is a particular conception of the state, but it has now become the global conception of the state, right? The resurrection of the Mandala state is not possible. You can't have revolution in one country. That doesn't work. Okay.
Thank you, Pak Andi. Achdian, you want to comment?
Thank you. I think the point is not only, the problem is not in the theory. The main problem, which is much more important for me today, is how to built the base of the Bandung Conference, the solidarity between the global south, something like that. So we already have a lot of bunch theory, but we still have to we still have a limitation to know each other among ourselves. When I was in the Philippines, I asked the Philippines college historians, and I said to them that, how did you understand about Indonesia? How it came about? They learned it from Cornell. They learned it from, they did not, do you know me better? And I still do not know you better. I know you from DGL Hall, yeah? So the institution that create a base of dialogue among the Africa or America Latin and Asia is still a missing part that I think is important to fill in this context.
Yeah, I agree with the colonial presence as a problem, and I think there are a lot of issues that need to be looked at. This internal colonialism, for example, is serious. Now, when we talk about center periphery, even in Indonesia itself, then you have like different forms that basically replicate the old colonial past or order. And question then is, do we need post-colonial studies to address that? No? Because some of the questions, as been said before, very particular set of issues. So I agree, and there are different forms of colonial oppression right now, gender-based, race, sexuality, and all that. So we need to expand that. Post-colonial studies, in a sense, helped us to think about these issues. No, but it's not enough. We need a lot more in order to kind of develop a stronger, a more solid theoretical framework that is also politically relevant. Yang kedua, soal nama kota saya nggak begitu ngerti. Maksudnya apa ya? Buitenzorg, Bogor. Merdeka. Oke. Ya udah bener itu. Soalnya misalnya kayak gini ya, kita ambil contoh India gitu. Sekarang ada trend ya untuk mengubah nama kota gitu ya. Bukan sekarang sih sebetulnya, 20 tahun yang lalu ya. Bombay jadi Mumbai, ya, Madras jadi Chennai dan seterusnya gitu ya. Masih bergulat dengan itu. Ya. Kita di sini pergulatannya agak beda kalau saya lihat gitu. Sekarang ada problem masing-masing ingin punya wilayah kekuasaannya sendiri, ya, maka terus ada daerah-daerah baru itu, ya, kabupaten baru, kecamatan baru, desa baru, dan seterusnya gitu. Dan tidak sedikit dari mereka merujuk ke sejarah, ya. Dan itu serius sekali itu, kerjanya sampai ke Leiden sana cari-cari peta gitu, cari batas wilayah dari 400 tahun yang lalu. Ya menurut dia nenek moyang saya dulu sebenarnya penguasa di daerah ini, kenapa kampung dia yang sekarang ini jadi desa dan seterusnya. Ini never ending, ya. Akan ada terus problem-problem, dan saya kira colonial presence itu kait kelindan ya dengan urusan seperti ini gitu. The last question, alternative in international relations. Yeah, I think Beng, you cannot go back to Mandala or all these like ancient types of states. No? But are there alternatives? Of course there are. On a practical level, you have the global justice movement, no? Which I think defies borders, like state borders and all that, and try to build like people-to-people relationship in different forms, and where people basically they ignore borders. Yeah. So I think international relations today also need to shift away a little bit from states to look at what people are doing in real life, in society. And if you look at the art scene here in Southeast Asia, or Asia in that regard, it's very important. You really can see how different ideas have resonance, no? In different communities regardless of the state borders. No? I was in East Timor back in 1990 when there was like the process of East Timor becoming independent. I was on a beach in the eastern part of East Timor, in Los Palos. It was like total chaos, no? But then there I met a fisherman, yeah, from Kendari. Yeah, he was sitting there, just like that, and I was like, with some Timorese, and yeah, he is also an Indonesian. I said, what are you doing here, sir? I was fishing. That's what his response was, no? I mean, you understand the situation. Well, yeah, I saw a lot of soldiers, but it's not in my interest. I'm here just for fishing. No, so you have lots of these people who would transgress borders, like all the time. And for them, they, all these like Westphalian constructs of states probably are meaningless. Now, there's this interesting study, James Scott, about the people without states, no? Living on a vast area, a geographical area in Southeast Asia, even to the eastern part of South Asia. And yeah, I think if you are interested to look at that more, that would be really interesting for us here as well. If you see Indonesian communities, their interaction with the state is very different. No? Java has been colonized for a long time. Yeah. Then you can see culture, history, and that's why we have like not so many small entities. No? Like for example in Sulawesi. In Sulawesi, first interaction with the modern state was back in the 1970s. Yeah. They even didn't know colonialism whatsoever. Yeah. In many places of Indonesia. Kalimantan, the same, even in Sumatra. So you have all these different histories in the plural that are worth studying. And I think if we are to expand these, our ideas about how to have a better world, alternative for the future, then we should look more carefully into that.
Well, we have come to the ending of the time. I would like to say thank you to our speaker and commentators. And also, I would like